In video episode 34, we saw that the practice of free trade according to comparative advantage meant lower buying prices, higher selling prices, and greater global production, all of which means improved living standards. Do you know how many countries in the world are engaged in trade? Every single one. There's not one country in the world that's completely self-reliant. And do you know how many countries in the world practice completely free trade? None. Not one single country practices trade free of any restrictions. So, if free trade is so fabulous, then why do all countries put restrictions in place? Perhaps it's best to take one step backwards and ask, who has the power to put trade restrictions in place? That would be each country's government. Why would the government put such restrictions in place? The government places trade restrictions in order to protect domestic industries from foreign competitors. Now ask yourself this. Which domestic producers would seek such protection? Surely not all of them. Some domestic producers already have a natural advantage in production over the foreign competitors. This is the key. The only domestic producers who would need protection are those who would be driven out of business under free trade, those who have a comparative disadvantage in production. So what arguments could the weak, disadvantaged producers make to the government to convince it to provide protection in the form of trade restrictions? Well, there are several. First, there's the domestic jobs argument. If some type of trade restriction, say a tax or a quota, is placed on incoming foreign goods, then consumers will have to purchase domestic goods instead, right? And if the demand for domestic goods is higher, then the need for workers to produce those goods is higher. Look at the U.S. steel industry. With protections in place, more U.S. steel is purchased and more U.S. steel workers have jobs. The domestic jobs argument is pretty persuasive with politicians because voters with jobs are happy voters. Here's the rub, though. While trade barriers mean more jobs in the protected industry, they actually cost jobs in other industries. Think again about the U.S. steel industry. Historically, taxes, called tariffs, have been imposed on imported steel, so the U.S. producers don't have to compete at such a low price. But this means that steel will cost more to the consumer. Who buys steel? The auto industry, perhaps? Construction firms? Steel drum manufacturers? Any industry that uses steel as a resource will face rising costs, which will lead to decreased supply, which means fewer jobs in all of those industries. So while steel workers may have more jobs, workers in all the downstream industries, like auto workers and construction workers, will lose jobs. On net, especially in a country like the United States, where disadvantaged areas tend to be raw materials or low-end materials, this will result in a net loss of jobs. Argument for protection number 2, level playing field. The logic here is that the foreign producer has some unfair advantage over the domestic producer, and the trade restriction would just even things up a bit. An unfair advantage might be if, say, the foreign producer was receiving subsidies from its own government such that costs were reduced and the foreign producer's product could be sold very cheaply in our market. But what happens if the foreign producer just has an advantage? Are all advantages unfair? In 1997, the collapse of the Thai baht kicked off a wholesale financial collapse in Southeast Asia. As Asian currencies lost most of their value, becoming very cheap, Asian products became cheap. Suddenly, U.S. steel producers were facing extremely cheap Asian steel and went to the U.S. government to seek protection. The question I have is this: did the Asian producers have an unfair advantage? Did they deliberately plan for their currencies to lose over 90% of their value just so they could sell more steel? The term fair is a slippery thing, somewhat subject to interpretation. The other difficulty here is that one country may dispute the fairness of another's restrictions and retaliate with restrictions of its own, eventually escalating into a trade war. A third argument for trade restrictions is that they can raise additional revenue for the domestic government. A tariff, or tax on imported goods, will generate added dollars, as would revenue from the sale of quota licenses. But in a country like the U.S., where only a very small percentage of government revenue comes from traded goods, remember we saw in the budget episode that about 90% of federal revenues come from income tax, payroll tax, and corporate tax, does it make sense to harm consumers by making imported goods more expensive? The government revenue argument is likely to be more compelling for governments of poor nations where there isn't much income to tax. The only place to squeeze additional revenue is from businesses, especially internationally. A fourth argument used in favor of trade restrictions is the national defense argument. If an industry is critical to the national defense, we should protect it in peacetime to make sure that it's still around in times of war. Some industries may spring to mind immediately as being critical to the national defense: tanks, guns, munitions, aircraft, shipbuilding. But then what about the metal used in all of these industries? Shouldn't that be protected? What about our food supply or uniforms for our troops? Or the producers who make buttons for the uniforms? You can see where this is headed. It becomes difficult to draw a hard and fast line separating industries that are critical to the national defense from those that are not. This becomes compounded when you realize that in recent years, the argument has been broadened from critical to the national defense to critical to the national interest. For example, some countries have restricted the amount of U.S. entertainment and publications, like movies and magazines, that are allowed in because they feel it would not be in their country's national interest to allow their own cultural identities to be swallowed up by U.S. pop culture. The infant industry argument is number 5 on our list. This says we should protect and support new industries until they're mature enough to compete on their own. I can understand this. In the town where I grew up, there was an economic incubator. If you had an idea for a new business, you could put in a proposal. If you're successful, you'd start up your business in the incubator building, enjoying lower rent and immediate access to business consultants. After a designated period of time, your business would move out and someone else would move in. Here's the drawback with federal support for a new industry. Who is in the best position to know when the industry is ready to leave the nest? The industry is. So if the government goes to the industry and says, "Hey, you ready yet? Can we take the restrictions away?" What's the industry going to say? "Sure, go ahead." More likely, the response will be, "No, not yet. Ask us again in a couple of years." In the past, some countries would protect these infant industries for decades. In the U.S., at least, the International Trade Commission, or ITC, places time limits on protection and usually weans the industry off by progressively decreasing the level of restrictions over that time period. There is one more method that goes against the natural flow of free trade, but it's less about protecting a weak domestic producer from foreign competition than it is about giving your domestic producer an artificial boost into other countries' markets by subsidizing them so they can take over market share abroad. This method of creating international dominance is, of course, squarely in the arena of unfair advantage, see argument number 2, and is really an open invitation for other countries to retaliate against you with restrictions of their own. In this episode, I went over many reasons why a government might agree to protect the economic interests of its domestic producers, even though they have a comparative disadvantage in production. Next time, I'll show you in more detail how the government can protect domestic producers by using tariffs, quotas, voluntary export restraints, or non-tariff barriers to trade. Next time, types of trade restrictions.